Hallo, liebe Zuhörerinnen und liebe Zuhörer. Im Zuge unserer Recherchen zu dem Spiel NEUROMANCER haben wir 2 Interviews mit Beteiligten geführt. Einmal mit Bruce Balfour, dem Autor-Designer des Spiels, und mit Troy Miles, Designer-Programmierer an dem Spiel. Diese beiden Interviews veröffentlichen wir jetzt und ihr hört gleich das erste davon, nämlich mit Bruce Balfour. Das Interview war in Englisch, Balfour ist Amerikaner, aber wie üblich haben wir am Ende des Interviews auch wieder eine deutschsprachige Zusammenfassung. Das heißt, wer von euch da gleich hinspringen möchte, ihr könnt doch einfach in die Kapitelmarken gucken. Da ist das markiert. Und damit wünsche ich euch viel Spaß mit unserem Gespräch mit Bruce Balfour über NEUROMANCER.
Another visitor. Stay a while. Stay forever.
Ein Podcast über alte Spiele von 2 alten Männern. Stay Forever mit Gunnar Lott und Christian Schmidt.
Hello everyone, today Gunnar and I are very happy to be able to talk to one of the creators of NEUROMANCER, the game that we have been playing for the past 7 weeks, and as usual we have questions and we're going to pose them to Bruce Balfour. Bruce, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, long-time listeners of our podcast should be familiar with the name Bruce Balfour, as we have talked about him before in our episode on the Laura Bow adventure games. Bruce was the designer and producer for the second Laura Bow game, The Dagger of Amon-Ra. At Sierra, he also created Outpost, a game with a colorful history that we may need to talk about at some point in the future. But today we're going to focus on Bruce's time before Sierra, when he was with Interplay, where NEUROMANCER was created. Before we go there, I should add that Bruce is first and foremost an author with, if I counted correctly, currently 7 books under your belt, both fiction and non-fiction, if I'm not mistaken.
6 or 7, depending on what you count. And then there's the one non-fiction book, the Post-Strategy Guide.
That's quite an achievement already from our point of view. But we're here to talk about your games of you, or one game in particular, NEUROMANCER. But let's start at the beginning. Bruce, this idea of being a writer was with you from a very early age, and coming out of school, you decided to pursue this profession. How did you go about that, and how did that lead you to be with Interplay?
I think I started writing magazine articles when I was about 15. So over the following years, I was doing that, writing a lot of short stories that I never sold to fantasy and science fiction magazines. Eventually, Twilight Zone magazine bought 2 of my stories at once, so that was the big thing for me. And I just started college at the time. But I have a long history with science fiction. I was very involved in it for a long time, particularly in the newer styles that were developing. That also evolved into that William Gibson picked up on. There was the new wave of science fiction, and that evolved into cyberpunk. And then in my background, a lot of things sort of came together. There was my science fiction background. I studied film production for several years and computer science. I worked at NASA on an artificial intelligence project, served as a computer operator on a high-altitude flying observatory for NASA for a little while. So I did all these strange things. I was always looking for odd things to get involved in odd careers and things. And then I moved back to Southern California to be an engineering test driver for Subaru after I worked at NASA. Throughout that period, I was writing fiction. So being a science fiction writer and a mystery writer with published short stories, and I wrote a lot of comics in my early 20s, that led to my working on the science fiction RPG Wasteland for Interplay with Mike Stackpole. And Mike introduced me to Brian Fargo. So I came in, I took over design and writing several sections of Wasteland, and that involved writing small chunks of assembly language code as well. So I got some use out of my computer science background. But, it's funny to think of all that now because it's just the crude mechanics of trying to use a computer at that time and do unusual things with it, right? And stretch the possibilities of the technology. And this was just after Infocom had more or less popularized text adventures coming out of the things that were running on mainframes at the time. So the text adventures were doing pretty well when we did NEUROMANCER. See, I worked on Wasteland, and then I wrote the text and the manual for Battle Chess, and then NEUROMANCER came up, and that was intended for Mike Stackpole, but then he was busy working on Bard's Tale 3.
He was your introduction to Interplay, if I understood you correctly. So how did you know him?
We'd been friends for several years. He lived out in Phoenix. I lived in California, but we had a common set of friends in Phoenix. And I was traveling out here each year when I was in high school to work at a game company. It was pretty much paper-based games, but also they did Tunnels and Trolls and things like that. But they also were doing these play-by-mail games. So people would write out their turns, mail them in, and then they would run them on their computer and then send back the results to the players. And they were doing pretty well with that. And a bunch of my friends were working there, so I ended up working there for a while. And that was my actual first contact with computer-based games, you might say, since that was play-by-mail. Yeah, so I had worked on Battle Chess. I also did an adaptation of the Robert Heinlein novel, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, for Interplay. And Activision was going to be the distributor for that. And they wanted to hold it until the intended movie got made. And then that never got made. I know you've spoken to Bob Bates in the past, and later on I did another adaptation of The Moon is a Harsh Mistress for Bob Bates at Legend, and then that didn't get made for the same reason. So we got pretty far along with it in both cases. It just never got made. First time around, Robert Heinlein, the author of the novel, was still alive, and he was very excited about the whole idea of doing a Moon is a Harsh Mistress computer game. But for whatever reason, it just never got made.
What were you hired for specifically at Interplay? What was your role?
The ideas and the writing. So when I started working on Wasteland, the design component was really about the writing and the design. So in the case of Wasteland, they had come up with a game system already. Alan Pavlish was the programmer on that one. He was busy building this very specific game engine for Wasteland that they hoped would be reusable. Because again, it was a small company and they had to try and make the best use of their resources so they would develop a game environment that they could reuse again with a different story over and over again, hopefully. So I came into it from the storytelling side, the design side, and then Wasteland was broken up into several different maps. So there were a few of us working on different maps, and I ended up with about half of them, I think, for that game. I also lived near Interplay, and Mike Stackpole lived out in Phoenix, so he wouldn't visit as often, and they liked the fact that I was nearby. But it was based on the writing I'd done before, the fiction writing that I'd done before that appealed to Interplay and Brian Fargo, so that's why I was brought in.
It's quite unusual for that time to hire a writer specifically.
Yeah, it was unusual. And of course, even now, say, when they're going to make a movie out of somebody's book, they very rarely are allowed to write it because it's a whole different style, a whole different format than what they're used to doing. Novels are very internal. You know what the person is thinking, the protagonist is thinking, and what the characters are thinking, and you can't really do that on film. It's more about what you see and the environment, and people have to say things to be able to get the style, the story content out for film. So it's similar with a computer game. And this, of course, still being early on, we're still trying to figure out how to adapt novels to a computer game environment with all the technical limitations of the time. The group at Interplay, it was nice because they were all kind of working with similar assembly language code, which was pretty much the most basic level of code you had to write for any particular computer processor. So they would be specializing in like the Commodore 64 or the Atari, but they would share information. So there was the small group focused on just generating code to do different functions and get more out of the individual machines. So they were very hardware, software oriented. But, as often happens, people that are more like that, they're more like engineers. They don't necessarily think in fiction terms. So the fiction side of it comes in and helps create a world around what they're trying to do, and you give them guidance that way. And that's kind of what the design process is creating a world to tell a story in. And sometimes the world is all you can really do with an adaptation. And we'll talk about that more later, but trying to get the flavor of the world, the components of it, so you have some experience of what it might be like in the story environment. But we're all very serious. We're all working very fast because Interplay didn't have a lot of money. They wanted to survive. But we had a good time doing it. It was nice being part of that team, where they're all working in one direction, trying to turn out something that's new and in a new style. Then you release it on the market and see if you succeeded or not.
We're always very curious to get a better idea of what the work environment was like back then in a company like Interplay, which of course would be huge and very famous later on. And these were the early days of this important player in the games market. So what was it like? What were the offices like? What was work culture like? Can you give us an impression?
The offices were very basic. It was like a regular office space with maybe 3 or 4 different rooms. Brian had his office, so that took up one of the closed off rooms. But it was pretty stark in there. It's like basic desks, a lot of computer hardware lying around because you'd swap boards in and out sometimes of your Apple computer. Not a whole lot of decoration on the walls, except for a couple of game posters from previous games that they had done. It was more about what was going on inside their heads than it was what was going on outside, right? Like I was saying, because of the focus they had on trying to do these new things, stretch the limits of the hardware, they were creative in that sense, and it was nice to work with them. Most of them had a good sense of humor, which we pretty much had to, because always having the frustrations of, I want to do one more thing here in this room, and I can't because there's not enough memory in the computer. And then, of course, that got reflected in the NEUROMANCER game, where you're dealing with memory limitations and all these upgrades to your hardware and all that. That was almost like a simulation of how we were working at Interplay.
How was communication like? Was this like an open space where opinions flying around and people talking, or everybody just building something and then showing it around when it's done?
It was mostly really quiet. People working individually at their desks. I was a consultant, so I wasn't there constantly. Same thing with Mike Stackpole. So when we came in, it was sort of like okay, well, now we can talk because these guys are here. We need to talk to them about things. And so then it would get a little more animated, I think. But for the most part, they were so focused and they didn't really talk about it. It's kind of like if you've ever heard the stories about software engineers at Microsoft. There's a whole concept around flat food. At the Microsoft offices in Redmond, Washington, you have these long, long hallways that are all identical doors facing each other. And it's really hard to tell like where you are sometimes because it all looks identical no matter where you go. They all have their doors closed and they're all working in there individually. And a lot of them didn't want to be bothered. So there was the concept of flat food. So they would email somebody and say, I need pizza or something. If somebody was going for pizza or some other kind of flat food they could get out of a vending machine, they would bring it down and they wouldn't even open the door. They'd slide it under the door. And then the engineer would have his food and he could keep going and work his 20-hour day or whatever it was. I think that culture is still around a lot of places. But still, with software engineers, they don't spend a lot of time talking for the most part. It's all internal.
The manual for NEUROMANCER has a page which is dedicated to Troy Miles, the programmer for NEUROMANCER, where he basically describes the creation process and then gives a couple of thank yous. And that's mainly focused on the intense work that he put into the game. So he mentions that it was 24-hour day, 7 days per week. He calls it a long, arduous adventure, forsaking sleep and fun, etc., etc. So it doesn't sound like that much fun. It sounds like crunch, essentially, like intense crunch.
Yeah. And again, too, with when Sierra earlier on was in the same position where they didn't have big teams, you'd have individual designers who were also programmers, and a lot of them worked at home. They would give them short deadlines, like you had to have this game done in 3 months, start to finish. So there wasn't a whole lot they could do. And they developed an in-house game engine that was proprietary. And part of the strategy behind that at Sierra was that if you hired a programmer who was an assembly language programmer, they had to learn your in-house code and how to use the software engine. And once they did that, they were locked in there because you couldn't transfer that skill anywhere else. So it was a way of hanging on to people that were designers and programmers because they spent a lot of time learning this, and now this was where they could do their games. But still would have these short deadlines, and as the games got larger, the deadlines were still comparatively short. Like I was saying with Interplay, they needed money, so they had to crank out things as quickly as they could. Like with the Commodore 64 games, there it made more sense to have just one programmer really doing everything. And then if they needed some assistance from somebody else that understood their code, they could get a little help from them. But that wasn't as common. It might be they needed some code to run a driver to run a speaker on the computer or something like that to be able to play music. But for the most part, it was very individual sort of exercise when it gets to the coding part of it. So pretty quiet.
Let's go back to Neuromancer. As you mentioned, in 1984, William Gibson published the novel. And how did the rights to produce a game based on that novel then end up with Interplay?
So there's a story. Of course, Neuromancer, written by William Gibson, he had not made a lot of money writing before that. And he also didn't understand how a lot of the rights should have been handled because he was new at it. The whole thing around the rights to Neuromancer is a mixture of Hollywood connections. So it was Timothy Leary, who was a celebrity at the time, which I'll tell you a little bit more about, but he was involved along with a plastic surgery money from New York City and the game publisher Electronic Arts. But Gibson had earned very little money. He got, I think, $100,000 for the rights, the media rights to Neuromancer. But the reason the Neuromancer movie never got made was because the rights had been acquired by Cabana Boy Productions. They didn't have $100,000 either, but they worked at the Beverly Hills Hotel at the pool serving drinks. And so that's why they were Cabana Boys. They had never made a film before. While they were serving drinks, they had gotten interested in Neuromancer and wanted to buy the rights. And they talked to Deborah Rosenberg, and she was married to a New York plastic surgeon. He was kind of a celebrity surgeon. He would be on television a lot. And he was out in Los Angeles for a conference. So his wife was out by the pool, and these Cabana Boy guys talked to her. And she said basically that she would like to come up with the money for the rights. But part of the deal was that she would be able to write the script. And she'd never written a script before. She had no idea how to write a script. Earl MacRouch, who was the guy who wrote Buckaroo Banzai, he did a New York was a mafia movie. I think it was supposed to be a musical. So neither of those made a lot of money. Buckaroo Banzai became a cult film over time, but when it came out, it wasn't very popular. So Earl MacRouch was supposed to write the script, and he did finally, but the deal was that Deborah Rosenberg was going to write it. And then around the same time, Timothy Leary had read Neuromancer. He contacted Gibson and then got in touch with Cabana Boy Productions when he found out they had the rights. Tim Leary wanted to make a game out of it. Tim had done one game before for Electronic Arts, and that was Mind Mirror, and that was released in 1986. And it was this psychological study of yourself. It had personality graphs and observations. You could reprogram your brain, supposedly. And then you could play through various life situations, scenarios, and play yourself, but with different personalities. And it just didn't go over very well. They thought Tim Leary had enough of a name that he'd be able to sell games, and the ones they did sell were probably based on his name. But as far as a game goes, it wasn't really fun, and it wasn't really a game. It's more like a personality test. He pitched Electronic Arts on the idea of a Neuromancer game, and I still have those notes, and they were basically character descriptions exploring their personalities a lot. And he never really described how it would be a game. He was just doing personality profiles, basically, of all the characters. And he was very interested in computer technology and artificial intelligence concepts and a variety of other things. And then Tim Leary was a fan of the Infocom game Suspended because it required the player to operate through multiple personalities again in the form of specialized robots. So most of what I was given about the Neuromancer game was these pages of text that Leary had written about the personalities, but there wasn't anything else there in terms of a game concept. So Electronic Arts said no. He tried Activision. Activision said no. But Electronic Arts, the producer there, Joey Barra, had worked with Brian Fargo before on Bard's Tale and so on. So he passed on Larry's game concept. So Leary and his wife drove down to the Interplay offices that were in Newport Beach, California, in Southern California. And Brian quickly figured out that Leary was a smart guy, but he didn't have any technical understanding of computers or software or game development. So he fell back into sort of a consulting role, but he was still trying to connect us to people like his friends, Devo, Mark Mothersbaugh, and a variety of other people he thought might be involved in the game somehow. There were some famous artists and David Byrne, the musician. And I think on the cover of Neuromancer, that face on there was based on David Byrne.
Timothy Leary obviously is a central figure to this story, but our listeners in Germany might not be familiar with that name. Can you maybe describe who he was and why he was famous?
Sure. So Tim was an interesting character. He had a very big personality. He was a clinical psychology professor at Harvard, and when he became famous in the 1960s. This was back when magic mushrooms and LSD were still legal, and they were starting to get used for research purposes to study psychology and therapies using these drugs. So Tim and another professor ran this big research project using prisoners and later on some students that had volunteered to document the effects of LSD and psilocybin along with psychological treatment to document those effects. Before that, a lot of people hadn't heard of LSD, and after that, everybody heard about LSD. It was outlawed by the government, I think, just a couple of years later, and Tim Leary was one of the people that they called as a witness in the Senate. Harvard fired both of those professors, but Tim Leary was still trying to popularize the use of LSD and other psychoactive chemicals for mind expansion and for psychological therapy. So he basically went out into the world and started popularizing LSD. And as a result, he had a lot of enemies, but then he also had a lot of celebrity friends. He was good friends with the Beatles, for example. And first or second time he was arrested, he had some cannabis with him. Oh, he was crossing the border over from Mexico and they forgot they had some cannabis with him. Supposedly it was him and his wife. So they got arrested. And that case, they got thrown out of court. But when he came out to talk to the media, he said he was going to run for California governor. And he had a slogan that was "Come Together," something like that. And he got his friend John Lennon to write the "Come Together" song for his governor's campaign, which was just a joke. He wasn't really planning on winning the California governor position. But he had all these friends. And so the LSD was a big part of that because he was the guy to go to that knew all about it. But he was traveling all over the world giving talks about it. Later on in the 80s, he'd gotten past the part where I think he was arrested 26 times or something. He'd been in prison for a while, but he still knew a lot of people. So then he started getting more involved in computers and trying to learn more about them, and then got interested in computer games. So anyway, that's the Tim Leary story.
Thank you for that. Now back to the original story. Timothy Leary had the rights to make a game based on Neuromancer from Cabana Boy Productions. He shopped that around essentially because he did not have the means to create the game himself. He needed someone to do that for him. And as you mentioned, Activision, EA turned him down, and then Interplay said, yes, we're going to do that. And you also mentioned that Timothy Leary had a big personality, I guess also a big ego. How easy was it for him to let go of the project? Because I think ultimately he was not involved in the creative decisions for the game, or was he?
Yeah, that's right. Of course, he'd been turned down twice. When Interplay picked it up, he was hoping he'd be more involved in it. But once he and Brian Fargo had talked enough about things like game mechanics and the practicalities of all the things that you could or couldn't do at the time on a computer, he kind of lost interest in it. And he was still trying to help in terms of, he had suggested a couple of artists. Keith Haring was one of them in New York City. And so again, Brian had to explain to him that, yeah, this is nice looking art, but it also has too many colors in it and it's too complicated for use in the game. The Amiga version of Neuromancer we did a little bit later. That looked better because it was an Amiga and it had a graphic processing unit. But I think he got frustrated. And the last thing really that he did was the connection with Devo. And he called Brian Fargo at 2:00 in the morning and said, hey, I got my friends, Devo, they'll do the music for you for the game. Of course, he woke Brian up in the middle of the night and he wasn't too thrilled about it. So after that, he just kind of stepped back, and we talked to him a couple of times, but that was really about it. We had a nice visit to his house, so we got to talk to him and see what his environment looked like. And he lived just down the street from Barbra Streisand. So it was actually a pretty nice neighborhood that he lived in Bel Air, which is next to Beverly Hills in Los Angeles.
Did he offer you any drugs?
No, he didn't. When we left, it was funny because he was going to have dinner with us at this really nice restaurant in Los Angeles. He couldn't go for whatever reason. And so he gave us one of his business cards. And he said, when you get there, just hand this to the guy at the door and he'll let you in right away. So he was trying to help how he could. But that was the big help, was getting us in to eat dinner at a nice restaurant. Yeah.
So Now, Neuromancer is an interplay, and you need to help us understand who did what in the game, because we look at the credits for Neuromancer, specifically the game design credits. There's actually 4 names there, 4 people credited. So there's Brian Fargo, the boss of Interplay, there's Michael Stackpole, there's Troy Miles, and there's you, of course. So who contributed what to the design of the game?
Well, of course, Brian, as you say, was managing everything. He acquired the rights to the game officially. And then he started working with Mike Stackpole on the design. So it was right after Bard's Tale 2 was selling well. So Brian wanted to include some of those popular RPG elements, and Electronic Arts was interested in that as well. But Brian asked Mike, and Mike was living in Phoenix, Arizona at the time, to put some of the game design and the game mechanics together while he was working on Bard's Tale 3. And then Mike worked on it for a few months, but he was overloaded with Bard's Tale 3 work. And I had just finished doing my work on the tutorial and the text for Battle Chess. So Mike suggested that I come in and help with the Neuromancer work. So then I came in to do the rest of the writing and design on Neuromancer. So the game structure, the mechanics, how it was going to be done, the style was kind of set up by the time I came into it. And then, of course, Troy Miles was assigned as the programmer, and he was the one that really had to make everything work. So he was coding in assembly language. It was the 6502 processor on the Commodore 64. He built the game engine. And as I said, we were still just a couple of years out of the Infocom text adventure phase of game development. Static graphic interfaces were still common. Text parsers were still common for the descriptions and the actions. And some people had played with that, like Douglas Adams. He did a bureaucracy game for Infocom. And he took the whole text parser thing, like turn doorknob, look right, go through door, or whatever. And those would have normal actions in a text adventure game. But when Douglas Adams did it for fun, you could try turning the doorknob and it would say the door is locked. And then you try a bunch of other things, and then you try turning the doorknob again, and it'd say the door is locked. So you try a bunch of other things, and you come back again, now really frustrated, try turning the doorknob, and the door would open. And this was the bureaucracy game he did. He was trying to communicate the idea of bureaucracy throughout the whole game. So you would have to do things over and over again to make something work, or to make some system in the game work. Anyway, so the text parsers were still common. The simple character animations in Neuromancer were fairly new as well. And most games were also done on one floppy disk at the time. So then we ended up building a large hybrid game that was an RPG with adventure game elements. And it required 4 floppy disks. So you had to be switching those in and out when you were trying to do different functions or go to different parts of the game. But, you think about it, at the time, it was novel enough, people didn't mind doing it. They just appreciated having a lot of extra content on the disc. So there was more to it for what you were paying for. So people appreciated that.
Yeah, I played the C64 version of the game now for our playthrough. I had all the disc swapping. It's quite tedious.
Yeah.
From today's point of view. Okay, so then let's dive into the game's design.
Well, I knew you were going to ask me about William Gibson too.
True.
One interesting thing about William Gibson was that he had a good science fiction background, but he was never a computer user. And he had never used one before he wrote Neuromancer, and didn't quite a while after that, as I recall. But he's always thought of a lot of his writing as synthesis of various aspects of the world, the culture, and other novels that had come before that. And when he was writing Neuromancer, the movie Blade Runner just had come out from Philip K. Dick's book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And he thought he was dead in the water, that he would never be able to sell this book because it had a similar tone to what he was trying to do because of the movie. So he wrote, I think, the first half of the book something like 20 times. But he looked at a lot of things in terms of synthesis. So he was pulling different aspects of things and trying to develop something new with it. And then, of course, he did fairly well with it. So his closest experience wasn't using computers, it was actually playing arcade games. So when it came to having an adaptation of his novel, that was one of the things he was thinking about, was that he really didn't have any restrictions for us. He wasn't concerned about what we were going to specifically do with his story. He was more interested in just, getting paid well for his novel. But as long as we were interpreting the world in a way that we thought he would like, then he was fine with it. But then, of course, that freedom creates its own set of challenges at the same time. But he was happy with the way it turned out. And it goes back to the synthesis idea, is that he was used to borrowing concepts from a variety of different places and turning them into something new. And so when it went to a computer game version of his novel, he understood enough of what we had described to know that we couldn't just do everything exactly that way. Even if it had been just a straight adventure game, there would be all these other branches that would not have been in the original novel and holes that you come across just trying to make the world more functional. Not necessarily realistic, you do sometimes, but just in making it functional, you run into gaps as well. He was happy with it, and I guess that's the main thing. I don't want to alienate the original author when I work on a project. Hopefully people will treat me the same way.
That's a good point, actually. You called it a computer version of the novel. And going into Neuromancer, the game, that's what Gunnar and I expected. We even reread the novel in preparation for the game. We thought, well, maybe that would give us an edge on some of the puzzles, And imagine our surprise when it dawned on us that what we were playing here actually was not the novel, not the storyline from the novel. It's quite far away from it, actually. You have some set pieces, like, of course, Shiba City, and some names crop up, some characters from the novel. But by and large, the game essentially ignores the novel's plot and does something new. And we found that a pretty striking decision. So we'd like to ask you, Bruce, why is that? Why not remake the plot of the novel as an adventure game?
Yeah, so Interplay itself had done well with Bard's Tale, which was a role-playing game. They wanted to do something a little different. They hadn't done novel adaptations before, and that's kind of where the adventure elements were also creeping into the game. It's still the issue of translating a big story like in a novel to a different format. So things do get left out, and the audience in this case has to directly interact with the story world. So with a game, the story and the world from the novel give you a lot of background, theme, perspective, concepts. And then you, like I mentioned, you fill in gaps of the world that weren't described in the source material. But if we did want to specifically tell the story of the book, it would have been better as a straight adventure game, probably. But tying into the Bard's Tale sales and so on, that's where a lot of the RPG elements came in. So then they were building a system on top of a system. I think there was some borrowed code from the Bard's Tale games that was used in Neuromancer as well. So a lot of it was that skill building, strength building, developing points, tracking money, doing memory management with your fictional computers that you're using, the decks, and so on. So part of it was technical limitations. Some of it was just knowing that we probably couldn't do a really good adaptation of the story itself unless it was a straight adventure game. And that was more of a commercial decision, is to do the RPG plus adventure game pieces.
Okay, so it wasn't that you were not allowed to adapt the plot of the novel. You could have done that, but you decided not to for the reasons that you just explained.
Right.
Okay, we speculated that maybe if you look at the novel, it's relatively complex. There's a lot of traveling, so a lot of locations. There's quite a few characters that might have been too much for an adventure game, because Neuromancer, as we have it right now, is relatively focused in terms of its location. So it's mainly Shiba City and cyberspace.
Yeah, right.
You touched already a little bit on that you not only deviated from the story, but you deviated from the tone of the book. And this is what we found even more striking, because this is funny. So this is ironical, this is funny, this is sometimes over the top. And this was not how Neuromancer was like. So this was a very earnest book. And why did you go into that direction? It deviated even into the goofy, where you had like the House of Pong, where the people are worshipping the joysticks. So was this your take on hacker culture, or where did this come from?
Well, and I think this ties back to, like you mentioned, what I was saying about hacker culture, is that there was a sense of humor there. It was, hackers are more of the counterculture type or subculture that they don't want to follow the rules. But with things like House of Pong, there were other references in there to Wasteland and our names are in there, our initials in there.
Quite a lot, yeah. I think Brian Fargo's name in lots of variations comes up at least 6 or 7 times in several databases.
I don't think my name is in there, but you'd see BJB, which are my initials.
Your name is in there as well, at least once, and also with some kind of variation of your name at least. But yeah, and Troy Miles' name as well, and Michael Stackpole, so you're all in there.
Right. And I think it goes back to the idea of it would have been hard to do a straight version of it. We could have done a more serious tone game, that's true, but it probably would not have sold as well. So there was a commercial factor to that, because most attempts at doing more serious type games at the time generally didn't do well, unless they were text adventures, where, like when you're reading a novel, a lot of it happens in your head. It's the things that you build around what you're actually reading. So this was more, the humor is there just more to keep people going. So we were trying to keep those kind of technology elements there, but just trying to play with it more. So I think part of it was more commercial decision in the sense that we couldn't have done a straight version adaptation of the novel, but then we also had it be amusing enough, which is another piece of positive feedback, that people would keep playing.
You make it sound like a very rational business decision. Let's be earnest, you like that. So you all put your names in there and your likenesses in some way. So you like the humor.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we like it too.
So you took the world and made it your own, in a way?
Yeah, pretty much.
The thing is that Neuromancer is a pretty perplexing game. Also based on what you just told us, because, I mean, Interplay has this opportunity to make a game based on a novel. And if I'm not mistaken, it's the first Interplay game that's based on a novel or on an IP or intellectual property. So you would assume that they take that serious, in particular if it's such a smash hit like Neuromancer. And then they bring in a writer in you whose key skill set is storytelling and writing a story. And then the end result, Neuromancer, the game, is pretty much a thoroughly systemic game, which is so much focus on that role-playing aspect of cyberspace, the battles. It's very much systems focused, a very mechanical game, and there's hardly any storytelling. And it's not for lack of text. There's a huge amount of text in Neuromancer. So you were pretty diligent, but it's just not text that would drive a plot. It's more like atmospheric text. And again, we wondered, why is that? What was the thought behind that?
Well, I think that there are pieces of the plot that you come across here and there. There are characters that you come across here and there throughout the game. There's probably a sequence you could follow where you would see a lot more about individual characters if you follow that particular sequence through the game. Some things you don't see because they disappear because you've done something similar in a different room. Maybe you don't need that chunk of text anymore and it just goes away. There might have been, I'm sure you played it thoroughly over several weeks, it sounds like.
We did.
The idea of the Case character, for example, he's still the anti-hero. He's still kind of a loser, having to go through the world and deal with AIs eventually. But the kind of underbelly of Cheapest City, it's reflected there. It's just the tone of it is different because, as you say, we used a fair amount of humor. So I think a lot of the concepts are in there, but it was a world based on the novel rather than specifically being the direct story out of the novel.
So I would have thought that if I just looked at the game and read through all of the text and then basically asked myself, so what was the idea of the writer? What was he trying to achieve? I would have guessed that his primary intention would have been world building, because as I mentioned, there is a lot of text in Neuromancer. And this is a time when you mentioned working on Wasteland, so you will remember that a lot of the text in Wasteland was actually externalized in a booklet that was in the box because the text did not fit on the floppy disk. Keeping that in mind, there's really a huge amount of text in the game in Neuromancer, but that text is used for world-building purposes. So there's a lot of fluff text essentially in all of these databases like emails and memos and things like that. So the purpose of the text there is not to actually drive a story forward, but to give us little fragmented pieces of information so that we get an impression of that world. So would you agree with that assessment, that you were primarily interested in basically fleshing out that world and creating context in that world?
Yeah, I think we're trying to stay in the environment but build it out. That's a good way to describe it. You mentioned the humor. The Easter eggs have been around for a long time in adventure games and so on, and that's where some of the humor comes from. But I think in trying to develop an effect, a serious effect on people from the serious tone of a novel through the interface of a computer is harder to do unless you've got some of the more filmic qualities that you can do in a film. So, like the music affecting mood when you watch a movie, or seeing how people respond to things, their expressions, and so on. And it's hard for me to think of anything else at the time that would have been able to do a better job with the technology to adapt a novel into a computer game. There may have been a couple of others around, I just can't think of them.
There were quite a few novels being adapted into computer games as text adventures. So as you mentioned, that was the medium of the early 80s. And that is, of course, closer than to the medium that the book is in, text. And I mean, for Neuromancer, what you wanted to do was have a graphical game and not a text adventure.
So I think if we were doing it now, it would be a lot easier to try and do something. If Interplay had had teams the size of Sierra teams, for example, we probably could have done a lot more, but we still would have had the same technology limitations. And I think it's more of looking back on it now, because it's hard to ignore all the other stuff that we know, like what we've seen done in games and what we've seen done with computer technology. It's hard to evaluate it the same way we would have if we had looked at it new in the late 80s. So in the late 80s, of course, it did well. People liked it. It won a bunch of awards. And some of that was the combination of the styles, but with the RPG and the adventure. But we were pushing the technology, even with the limited animation that we had. It was still pretty good for the time.
I found the game was like almost a two-actor. I came into the game and I thought, oh, now I'll be able to go into cyberspace. And then it takes quite a while before you have gathered the means of entering cyberspace. And then you almost not leave it anymore right until the end of the game. It's like two parts. It's not like mixed those in, you know, where you do a little bit of role-playing, fighting in the cyberspace, and then another puzzle to solve. It's this and that, almost like two games. Was this intentional in any dramatization thing because you viewed that cyberspace as a stronger form to the novel, or?
Well, I think essentially that was the payoff level for the game. Once you've done all this kind of bookkeeping exercise and built up all the tools and gone through all the exercises in the meat space, be able to get there. I think in the Amiga version, that's where it opens up into being a little more interesting graphical environment as well, even though it's abstract. But like in the novel, there's the effects, the physical effects on the protagonist of being in cyberspace. And we weren't reflecting that as much. But once they're in cyberspace, they don't do as much in the real world anymore. Because it was fairly late in the story, as I recall, where Wintermute and Neuromancer are that powerful, or Neuromancer is that powerful. So once you're in cyberspace, that's more the payoff level and more like this is getting towards the end of the game.
Would you say that the adventure part, where you gather all those things, is more like a prelude to the cyberspace? And the cyberspace is Neuromancer proper?
Well, and there's a training effect going on too, right? Because as happens in pretty much any game, maybe not as much now, but in most games where you have to get people used to the world and the mechanics of the world, if you hide the hints on how to do something in one place, they may never find it and they'll just get stuck. So we've salted them around various places in the bulletin boards or in talking to a character or whatever, and you'd learn a new code or you'd learn a new place to go to or whatever. So those kinds of game mechanics are all part of the training. And then once they understand that world enough, then we push them into the cyberspace environment where they're using these software tools that you can see what's happening as a result directly. And of course, in the Gibson world, all he was talking about was databases. And he knew the word. I don't think he really understood what a database was. But it represents some sort of a computer system that you're breaking into. So that's really sufficient for his purposes. So it's just going to a different style once you're in cyberspace and having built yourself and your equipment up to that level to where it's the payoff level and you understand what's going on.
Before we started the recording, you mentioned that you had revisited the game by watching a video of someone playing through Neuromancer. I wonder, how did this make you feel? How did you feel about the game when you saw it now after all these years?
At first, it was like sort of horrifying to see how crude things looked back then when they were first walking around doing things. Fortunately, the YouTube version you referred me to, the guy was making his comments as he was going through, and that was really helpful because he was having a good time, figuring things out and making his notes and doing all that. And it was the games then and for a while after, you had to map them. So you'd be able to find your way around in the world. The Neuromancer world wasn't too complicated, fortunately, but the maps and then taking notes. And after, I think just a few years later, early 90s, by then people didn't want to take notes in the games that they were playing anymore either. They considered it too tedious. And when I did the Laura Bow 2 game, it was a mystery. And so she's trying to solve this mystery and she has to take notes along the way. You do have the interface. You can see some of the notes on the screen, but you really had to keep track of what was going on. And so there were people that played that and said, I don't want to take notes anymore. I didn't realize there was going to be a test at the end of the game where I actually have to solve the mystery. And then there were different possible endings depending on how they may or may not have solved it. Looking back at these old games, I probably wouldn't want to take notes either. And I'm impressed that you guys were able to play through it all in these older types of games and be able to get through it and get to the end.
And when you watched the video, did you feel proud of the game?
Yeah, I did. It's like being part of game history. And with different things I worked on, it's like we did something new. We did it for the first time. And so now I've got that little piece of history that I'm connected to. And later on, I mentioned doing 3D rendered graphics in later games for Sierra, where at the time you needed render farms, these rooms full of computers that were all trying to process the same image. And they might run for a week and you'd end up with your spacecraft or whatever that looked 3D rendered and that you could animate. But it would take that long to build it. And movies at the same time and a little bit later were having the same problem. They were running basically supercomputers to be able to generate the wireframes and the rendered things that they were doing for like the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park. That was serious computing horsepower required to do those things. So the Outpost game I did was the first Pentium chip game from Intel. Intel gave us some money to write something that would require a Pentium chip level computer to play it. And there was that relationship a lot of times with the hardware companies where the game company would advance because the hardware company was giving them some money or they gave them a reason to push the technology a little bit more. So there was this whole process over time, over even just 10 years or so, where I was really involved a lot in computer games, where just seeing the technology change over that period and what you could now do with it, it just created new ways that you could potentially tell a story. Although I think eventually it got to the point where Hollywood had moved into the point where the stories started really going to the background. It was more about what things look like and shooter games and things like that. So there might ostensibly be a story there, but it was really a background thing. That was unfortunate. At that time, that's the way a lot of things were moving. And that's kind of why I was starting to get out of computer games, was because I didn't feel like it would be allowed to do as much as I would like to, even though all these new technologies were available, that I wouldn't be able to really use the storytelling skills as much. It would be more of a, okay, well, here's a room, here's an object to shoot at, and you kill this guy, and then you go on and kill this other monster over here, and so much went in that direction. But I think of that as the Hollywood effect. And those were cheaper to turn out because you'd get like a Jurassic Park game that DreamWorks Interactive did. I was one of two people that went to talk to DreamWorks Interactive after they'd been set up and running for about a year, Steven Spielberg's company, to interview as the CEO. And what I didn't like about the culture that they wanted to build was it was all about the art and the artists. and they wouldn't have any kind of structure to it. It was kind of a flat structure, and I couldn't see how you could produce a game with having a flat structure with just a lot of artists, like a few hundred artists, and that's it. Like, you're taking graphics out of a movie that won't work on a computer game platform in the first place, and now you're going to have to downgrade them to the point where these artists can work with it, and these artists are all just going to make art and somehow turn it into a game. But I was running across that so much that I got kind of disillusioned with it. So then I started doing consulting work for Microsoft and Broderbund and some others later on, because that was easier. I could come in and solve some problems for them or do a basic design for them, and then they would take that and run off with it and do whatever. But that's a lot of what I was doing later on, was solving other people's problems. My wife, I met her at Sierra. I was casting voices for the Lorabo game. A lot of people came in and auditioned. And it was a small mountain town, so it was kind of a limited pool that we were drawing from. I still needed somebody that could do a upper-class British accent, a Southern accent, and a French accent. And she came in, and she had theater training, and she did all three accents perfectly. And we were driving, I think, an hour each way down to Fresno from the mountains to a big recording studio. There was a really nice, big professional recording studio in Fresno. So I'd meet her down there, and we spent weeks doing these recordings because it was a 600-page script for the last thing that we worked on. And so we spent a lot of time together, and then I was finding reasons to do more recording with her. So then we ended up getting married, I think, a year or two after that. But the computer game business has done pretty well for me overall.
Well, that's very nice that you could say that. I'm glad to hear that. I have actually one or two more questions on the production of NEUROMANCER, because you mentioned earlier on that Interplay was pretty much always strapped for cash, needed money, which, looking at the history of Interplay, that is the line that goes through all of that. That's true for the early Interplay, even for the late Interplay as well. But coming back to the time of NEUROMANCER, so the fact that Interplay needed money pretty much all the time, did that impact the production of NEUROMANCER, and in particular the release of NEUROMANCER?
It created a lot of limits to what could get done in a certain period of time. So then, like I was saying, it was typically 3 to 4 months to do a game. Sierra had been doing the same thing just a couple of years before that, where it might be 1 or 2 or 3 people working on a game. And then they went over to where they created these groups that were handling these different functions like music and software development and so on. And out of that, they could build a bigger and better game as the technologies advanced. But having a 3 or 4 month period to develop a game is a pretty short period of time. So there isn't a lot of time to do something new. You might limit it to 1 or 2 things that are new in the game, because that's all you have time for. But there is always that driver, which can be good to have that creative push, the deadline. You have to get it done by this certain point, because it could drag on forever, because the hardware and the software capabilities would change even over a year. And you'd say, oh, I want to use this new thing now, or this new driver is available, or this new chip is available. So those can be good.
Did NEUROMANCER do well? Do you happen to know that?
Yeah, it did. It did. Computer Gaming World, I think, was really pushing it. They were impressed with it, and they pushed it a lot in the magazine. So we got an Adventure Annual Game of the Year award from them. There was one from the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. Games were still, of course, relatively new at the time, and we had something that looked interesting enough that it stood out on a convention floor, I guess. But that got a lot of attention because of the amount of traffic through the Consumer Electronics Show. It's hard to say if it had been like 2 years earlier or 6 or 7 years later, whether it would have done as well, just because the markets themselves change relatively quickly.
Did you earn royalties from the game?
Not on NEUROMANCER, no. I did on my Sierra games. I had a salary and decent royalty off of those. So I did pretty well off of those, and I could take some time after that to write novels, get my novel writing career started and that sort of thing. And then the nice thing about that is that I had pretty much full control over it. There would be an editor or two that would look at it and say, well, maybe you move a few scenes around, but you have full control of that book. So if it does well, it's because you did it well. And if it fails, it's because you failed or you didn't hit the market or whatever. So it was nice to have that control of working on novels. Now I'm finally getting back to that again. There was a long period there for several years. I was busy like getting my PhD and doing all these other things I've been doing. So now that's what I do on every weekend is I'm working on my mystery novels and trying to build up my skills in that area now.
Sounds wonderful, actually. Then our questions are thoroughly answered. Bruce, it's been a pleasure to have had you here. Thank you so much for all of these insights and best of luck for your future.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your doing this. It's great to hear that people are still playing these games, and you've both been great to talk to. So thanks a lot.
Das war unser Gespräch mit Bruce Balfour und ich fasse jetzt für euch kurz zusammen, was wir von ihm gelernt haben. Wir haben ihn natürlich zuerst mal gefragt, wie er überhaupt in die Computerspielindustrie gekommen ist. Also wie kam er denn dazu, bei Interplay zu arbeiten? Und dazu muss man festhalten, dass Bruce Balfour damals schon und auch heute primär Autor ist. Sein Abstecher in die Spielebranche war nur ein Teil seines Lebenslaufs. Er war ein paar Jahre dort aktiv und dort natürlich auch primär in einer gestaltenden Rolle, auch häufig als Autor von den Spielen. Und seine Leidenschaft fürs Schreiben hat schon als Jugendlicher angefangen. Er hat schon mit 14, 15 begonnen, Kurzgeschichten zu schreiben und die an Abenteuer- und Fantasy-Magazine zu schicken, in der Hoffnung, dass die dort publiziert würden. Bei 2 hat er auch Glück gehabt. Also 2 Geschichten hat er an das Twilight Zone-Magazin veröffentlicht. Das waren seine ersten Veröffentlichungen. Heute übrigens hat er 7 Bücher auf seiner Veröffentlichungsliste stehen, sowohl Romane als auch Sachbücher. Nach der High School ist er dann an die Uni gegangen, an die University of California in Los Angeles, um Filmproduktion zu studieren, hat dann aber nach einiger Zeit gemerkt, dass es da nicht so gut ist mit den Berufsaussichten und ist dann gewechselt an die University of California in Santa Cruz, um Informatik zu studieren. Das hat er auch abgeschlossen. Dann ging er zur NASA als Computerfachmann, hat dort im Kuiper Airborne Observatory gearbeitet. Das ist ein umgebautes Transportflugzeug mit einem Infrarotteleskop an Bord. Das fliegt dann da hoch über der Erde und macht Infrarotaufnahmen. Die haben damals Aufnahmen vom Space Shuttle gemacht, beim Wiedereintritt in die Erdatmosphäre. Dann ist er wieder zurück nach Südkalifornien gezogen, war eine Zeit lang Testfahrer bei Subaru. Und in dieser Zeit hat noch weitere Jobs und hat da immer nebenher schon geschrieben, vor allen Dingen auch für Comics geschrieben. Und schon in der Highschool hat Balfour in den Schulferien in Arizona gearbeitet bei einer Spielefirma, nämlich Flying Buffalo. Und das ist eine Spielefirma nicht im Sinne von Computerspielen, sondern Brettspiele und vor allen Dingen Play-by-Mail-Games, also Briefspiele. Flying Buffalo kennt man vielleicht daher am meisten, weil die einen Konkurrenten zu Dungeons & Dragons aus der Taufe gehoben haben namens Tunnels & Trolls. Das war eine Zeit lang auch ganz populär in den USA, aber wie gesagt, am erfolgreichsten war Flying Buffalo mit diesen Play-by-Mail-Games, weil die eine der ersten oder wenn nicht sogar die erste Firma in den USA waren, die in diesem Segment schon Computerunterstützung angewendet haben. Also bei Briefspielen kriegen ja Leute per Post ihren Spielzug zugeschickt, dann füllen sie da ein Formular aus, schicken das wieder zurück und die Auswertung von diesen Formularen und die Berechnung, was dann passiert und ja, den nächsten Spielzug sozusagen, das hat Flying Buffalo damals schon mit Computern gemacht. Da hat er also in den Ferien schon gearbeitet, hatte dort auch seine erste Berührung mit Computern im Zusammenhang mit Spielen, auch wenn es in diesem Fall noch diese Briefspiele waren. Und bei Flying Buffalo arbeitet auch jemand anders, nämlich Michael Stackpole. Das ist einer derjenigen, die Tunnels & Trolls mitgestaltet haben und für die schreiben. Und die beiden freunden sich an. Also Bruce Balfour kennt Michael Stackpole. Und Michael Stackpole wiederum arbeitet zu dieser Zeit, wir sind jetzt hier Mitte der 80er, bereits für Interplay als Autor, als Mitdesigner, vor allen Dingen an Wasteland. Und über die Empfehlung von Michael Stackpole kommt also Bruce Balfour dann auch zu Interplay. Und zwar nicht als Festangestellter, sondern als freier Mitarbeiter, vor allen Dingen als freier Autor. Er schreibt dann also schon an Wasteland mit. Ungefähr die Hälfte der ganzen Karten in dem Spiel und der zugehörigen Texte stammt von ihm. Dann arbeitet er an Battle Chess. Da gibt's jetzt nicht so viel Text, aber es gibt natürlich ein Handbuch dazu und das schreibt der Balfour. Und der Michael Stackpole arbeitet parallel an Bard's Tale 3. Denn Bard's Tale ist die erfolgreichste Serie von Interplay damals, Rollenspielserie. Der zweite Teil war extrem erfolgreich und deswegen soll ein dritter folgen. Da sitzt also der Michael Stackpole dran. Dass übrigens Interplay externe Autoren anheuert, die auch hauptsächlich fürs Schreiben da sind, ist in der Spielebranche ziemlich ungewöhnlich in dieser Zeit. Nicht aber für Interplay, da gehört schon so ein bisschen zur DNA, denn schon die allerersten Spiele Interplay hat in den frühen 80ern Text-Adventures gemacht. Die haben sie nicht selber geschrieben, sondern auch da waren schon externe Autoren dran. Denn Brian Fargo, der Gründer von Interplay, der weiß, was uns auch Bruce Balfour im Interview bestätigt hat. Der Kernstab von Interplay, das sind technisch fokussierte Leute. Das sind gute Programmierer, die da arbeiten, aber gute Programmierer sind nicht unbedingt auch gute Erzähler. Und Interplay ist eine der Firmen, die das weiß, die das begreift und sagt, okay, da brauchen wir Leute, die das können. Eben Leute wie zum Beispiel Stackpole oder Balfour. Balfour hat übrigens auch einen Vorteil gegenüber Stackpole, denn Michael Stackpole arbeitet und lebt in Phoenix, Arizona. Also weit weg von Interplay. Die sitzen in Kalifornien, in Los Angeles, und da lebt auch Bruce Balfour. Der hat es also nicht weit ins Büro. Bruce hat uns erzählt, dass er in dieser Zeit, also wo er für Interplay an Wasteland und an Battle Chess gearbeitet hat, dass er da auch ein Konzept für ein neues Spiel ausgearbeitet hat, nämlich eine Spielumsetzung des Robert Heinlein-Romans Revolte auf Luna für Activision. Der Publisher von Interplay war am Anfang Activision, also das fiel noch in diese Zeit. Aber Activision sagte dann, nee, wir warten da mit der Umsetzung von dem Spiel, bis der angekündigte Film kommt. Da sollte damals eine Verfilmung von Revolte auf Luna irgendwann mal stattfinden. Aber das passierte nie und dementsprechend ist auch dieses Spiel nie umgesetzt worden. Und dieses Schicksal hat sich wiederholt für Bruce Balfour. Er hat nämlich Jahre später dann auch mal für Legend Entertainment gearbeitet, die Firma von Bob Bates. Und dort hat er nochmal ein Konzept für eine Spielumsetzung von Revolte auf Luna geschrieben. Und auch dort hat dieses Konzept das gleiche Schicksal ereilt, denn es ist nie umgesetzt worden. Okay, Klammer zu. Also Interplay hat in der Zeit nicht viel Geld. Die haben ein gutes Team, die arbeiten schnell, auch deshalb, weil einfach Produkte erscheinen müssen, das Geld reinkommt. Und der Balfour, er hatte in den paar Jahren, in denen er bei Interplay war, das müsste so ungefähr zwischen 86 und 89 gewesen sein, hatte er da eine gute Zeit. Er sagte, er mochte den Humor von dem Team, er mochte den Pragmatismus. Interplay war eine unprätentiöse Firma, die saßen in relativ einfach gehaltenen Büros, die waren vollgestopft mit Hardware. Er erinnert sich daran, dass es da immer eher still war in dem Büro, weil die Leute sehr konzentriert gearbeitet haben, gerade die Programmierer. Interplay ist, wie gesagt, eine technisch orientierte Firma, viele Programmierer dort. Die hatten immer knappe Deadlines, die hatten das Konzept, dass pro Spiel ein Programmierer dran gesetzt war. Der war auch meistens spezialisiert auf einen Computer. Also im Fall von Neuromancer war das der Trial Miles auf dem C64. Ein Spiel, ein Programmierer, eine Plattform. So wurde bei Interplay gearbeitet. Ja, und wie kommen wir jetzt also zu Neuromancer? Das Buch, der Roman Neuromancer, stammt von William Gibson. 1984 hat er das geschrieben. Und Bruce Balfour hat uns nochmal diese hübsche Geschichte erzählt, die wir ja auch in unserer Hauptfolge schon ausführlich beschrieben haben. Nämlich, dass es da zwei Jungs gab im Beverly Hills Hotel, die sich Cabana Boy Productions nannten und die Idee hatten, dem Gibson die Rechte abzukaufen, also die Film- oder Medienrechte für eine Umsetzung von Neuromancer. $100.000 wollten sie ihm bieten, die hatten die beiden natürlich nicht, aber eine reiche Ehefrau eines Schönheitschirurgens, nämlich Deborah Rosenberg, die da am Pool rumlag vom Beverly Hills Hotel, die hatte diese $100.000 und hat sie den beiden gegeben, unter der Bedingung, dass sie also gemeinsam eine Firma gründen und dass Deborah Rosenberg das Drehbuch schreiben darf dafür. Da war niemand begeistert von dieser Idee, außer Deborah Rosenberg. Ja, und wer das Geld hat, macht die Ansagen. Dementsprechend kam es dann auch so. Ja, aus diesem Film ist nie was geworden. Diese Cabana Boy Productions hat Millionen verbrannt, aber ein Film kam nie raus. Aber sie haben zumindest einen Erfolg gehabt, nämlich sie haben William Gibson die Rechte abgekauft. Und es sind die Medienrechte, das heißt nicht nur Filme, sondern eben auch Computerspiele. Und da kommen wir zu Timothy Leary, berühmter Psychologe, bisschen Skandalnudel in dieser Zeit in den USA, wobei der Skandalzeit war eigentlich schon in den 70ern von ihm. Der hat in den 80ern angefangen, auch Spiele zu machen oder sagen wir mal eher so Entertainment-Programme, Selbstfindungsprogramme mit seiner eigenen Firma. Der war begeistert von Neuromancer, kontaktiert Cabana Boy Production und kriegt von denen die Lizenz, ein Computerspiel machen zu können. Timothy Leary hat bei Electronic Arts vorher schon eins untergebracht, Mind Mirror heißt das. Bruce Balfour sagt selbst, das war weniger ein Spiel, eher ein Persönlichkeitstest und Electronic Arts ist damit ein bisschen auf die Nase gefallen. Die haben zwar ganz gut was davon verkauft von diesem Spiel, aber weder ausreichend noch waren die Kunden sonderlich begeistert davon. Also als Delirium jetzt wieder ankommt und sagt, hier, ich habe diese Idee für ein Neuromancer-Spiel, sagt Electronic Arts nein. Aber Electronic Arts hat einen Producer, den Joe Ibarra, der arbeitet in der Zeit vor allen Dingen mit Interplay an der Bard's Tale-Reihe. Der stellt den Kontakt her zwischen Timothy Leary und Brian Fargo von Interplay. Brian Fargo und Timothy Leary freunden sich an und im Fargo wird relativ schnell klar, sagt Bruce Balfour, dass Timothy Leary keine große Ahnung von Computerspielen oder von Spielmechanik hat und dementsprechend verwendet Brian Fargo dann relativ viel Energie darauf, dem Leary dessen Ideen für ein Neuromancer-Spiel auszureden und ihm stattdessen klarzumachen, dass Interplay doch bessere eigene Ideen hätte für so ein Spiel. Als Beispiel sagt Bruce Balfour, dass der Tim Leary schon eine ganze Reihe von Künstlerfreunden an der Hand hatte, zum Beispiel den Künstler Keith Haring aus New York, der zwar schöne Artworks schon gemalt hat für Learys Idee von dem Spiel, die aber leider nicht gut umsetzbar waren auf den Computern dieser Zeit. Die sind viel zu farbenfroh, die sind viel zu kleinteilig und kompliziert. Das ist auf so einem C64 mit seinen paar Farben und der groben Auflösung so nicht darzustellen. Brian Fargo weiß sowas. Leary weiß es nicht unbedingt. Letztendlich kommt es also dazu, dass der Leary die Idee fallen lässt, da ein eigenes Spiel zu machen. Er steigt also aus diesem Projekt im Endeffekt aus. Ja, stellt noch ein paar Verbindungen her mit Devo zum Beispiel, mit der Band, die dann letztendlich den Soundtrack machen wird für das Interplay-Spiel. Aber ansonsten darf Interplay, Brian Fargo und seine Leute dürfen da jetzt selber ran. Wir haben den Bruce Balfour auch noch gefragt, wie sehr Tim Leary jetzt eigentlich involviert war in dieser ganzen Geschichte. Und Bruce sagte, naja, praktisch gar nicht. Also sie haben ein, zwei Mal was bei ihm nachgefragt und haben ihn noch mal besucht in seinem Haus in Bel Air. Das ist in der Nähe von Beverly Hills, also in einer reichen und guten Gegend von Los Angeles. Das Haus von Timothy Leary war direkt gegenüber dem Haus von Barbra Streisand, erzählte Bruce Balfour. Und als sie also mit dem Besuch fertig waren, hatten sie eigentlich vereinbart, noch in einem High-Class-Restaurant in Los Angeles Abend zu essen. Und Tim Leary konnte dann aber nicht, hat ihnen aber gesagt, hier, nehmt meine Visitenkarte mit, die gebt ihr dem Mann an der Türe und dann bekommt ihr da problemlos einen Platz. Und so war es dann wohl auch. Nun, also jetzt war Interplay zuständig für Neuromancer und hatte damit freie Hand, wobei da gibt's ja noch potenziell eine andere beteiligte Partei, nämlich William Gibson, also den Autor. Bruce Balfour erzählte, ja, auch den Gibson haben sie getroffen, auch mit dem haben sie gesprochen über Neuromancer, aber zum einen war der Gibson kein Computermensch, der hat auch vor Neuromancer und auch eine Zeit lang nach Neuromancer keine Computer benutzt. Balfour erzählte zum Beispiel, ja, im Roman nennt der William Gibson die Orte im Cyberspace Datenbanken, aber Balfour sagte augenzwinkern, er glaubt, der Gibson wusste nicht so recht, was eine Datenbank überhaupt ist. Er hat also von so Computerkonzepten nicht unbedingt eine Ahnung. Die einzige Erfahrung mit Spielen, die er gemacht hat, war mit Spielhallen, Spielen, Arcade-Games. Das war auch sein einziger Referenzpunkt. Gibson war aber insofern ganz angenehm, weil er keinerlei Vorgaben oder Erwartungen und auch keine Einschränkungen für das Team bei Interplay hatte. Er hat verstanden, dass es eine 1:1 Umsetzung der Romanhandlung nicht unbedingt sein könnte in so einem Computerspiel. Und der Bruce Balfour erzählte auch aus seiner Autorenperspektive, ein wichtiges Prinzip für William Gibson als Autor war die Idee der Synthese. Also Neuromancer ist ein Roman, in dem der Gibson viele, viele Einflüsse verarbeitet hat. So eine Art Collage und Hodgepodge von verschiedenen Stilen und Ideen. Das war ein bisschen auch sein Schreibprinzip. Und Balfour glaubt, dass Gibson dieses Computerspiel auch so gesehen hat, auch unter dieser Synthese-Idee. Also dass sein Roman auch wieder nur ein Teil von so einem neuen Ding ist, was dann da entsteht und nur ein Einfluss davon und dass da aber auch wieder andere Gedanken und Gestaltungsmerkmale mit reinfließen müssen, sodass da aus dieser Synthese wieder etwas Neues entstehen kann. Ob es so war oder nicht, können wir nicht beurteilen, aber zumindest hat Bruce das so beschrieben. Nun beginnt also Interplay dran zu arbeiten und bei Interplay wird erstmal Michael Stackpole beauftragt mit dem Design. Der arbeitet auch eine ganze Weile daran, der überlegt sich so ein Grundkonzept und ein Storygerüst, aber der hat ja parallel noch einen anderen Auftrag, der arbeitet an Bard's Tale 3. Und wenn wir ehrlich sind, ist Bard's Tale 3 das wichtigere Spiel für Interplay. Das ist ja die sichere Bank. Da wissen sie, dass sie davon gut verkauft haben in der Vergangenheit und auch weiter gut verkaufen werden. Das heißt, Stackpole ist damit gut ausgelastet und muss dann die Arbeit an Neuromancer abgeben. Und er schlägt vor, komm, lasst es doch mal den Bruce Balfour machen. Und so kommt also Bruce Balfour dann in das Team von Neuromancer zu einem Zeitpunkt, wo die Produktion aber schon läuft. Da ist Troy Miles schon lange dran, um das zu programmieren. Michael Stackpole hat da schon dran gearbeitet. Also die ganze Struktur des Spiels steht schon, der Stil ist schon festgelegt, die Spielmechaniken sind schon festgelegt. Im Endeffekt übernimmt Balfour jetzt die restlichen ausführenden Arbeiten, also noch die Texte fertig schreiben, noch die Spielmechaniken definieren oder Rätsel definieren, die noch nicht definiert sind und managt auch das Projekt. Der Programmierer ist, wie gesagt, Troy Miles, der schreibt das in Assembler, der baut die Game Engine. Festgelegt ist zu diesem Zeitpunkt auch schon, dass es ein grafisches Adventure wird. Es ist ja eigentlich noch die Zeit in den ausgehenden 80ern, wo es durchaus noch Textparser gibt. Infocom ist da immer noch eine erfolgreiche, populäre Firma. Aber wir haben natürlich schon den Übergang zu animierten Figuren in den Adventures. Sierra macht das schon seit Jahren. Manic Mansion ist auch schon ein Jahr vorher erschienen. Für Interplay ist es aber neu. Die haben zwar früher auch Adventures gemacht, Text-Adventures, aber eben noch kein grafisches. Über die Produktion sagte der Bruce Balfour, dass die Spiele damals in 3 bis 4 Monaten gemacht wurden. Da zweifle ich an seine Erinnerung, um ehrlich zu sein. Das galt auch im Jahr 1988 schon nicht mehr. Der Troy Miles hat uns im Interview erzählt, dass er ein Jahr lang an dem Spiel gearbeitet hat und das erscheint mir ein wesentlich realistischerer Wert. Aber Balfour sagte so oder so, die waren natürlich unter dem Deadline-Druck und Deadlines waren für eine Firma wie Interplay, die ja auch quasi von Produktion zu Produktion gelebt hat, waren die wichtig. Und es zwang in gewisser Weise die kleinen Teams und vor allem die Programmierer und Designer auch dazu, ihre Spiele dann auch fertigzustellen. Designer tendieren ja dazu, dann immer noch weitere Features einzubauen und Programmierer tendieren dazu, die Technologie zu verbessern oder vielleicht auch neue technologische Möglichkeiten dann noch ausnutzen zu wollen. Und Balfour sagte, da war die Deadline vor. Also diese Möglichkeit gab es dann nicht bei Interplay, zumindest nicht in dieser Zeit, nicht bei diesen Spielen. Ja, und damit kamen wir zu dem Frageblock, wo wir über Designentscheidungen gesprochen haben. Und ich muss ehrlich sagen, dass das nicht so wahnsinnig ergiebig war. Da war vermutlich auch Bruce Balfours Erinnerung an dieses 30 Jahre zurückliegende Spiel dann nicht mehr so klar. Wir fragten ihn natürlich, warum hält sich das eigentlich nicht an die Romanhandlung? Warum macht denn das NEUROMANCER-Spiel eine ganz andere Erzählung auf als das Buch? Man muss dazu sagen, dass Interplay noch nie ein Spiel vorgemacht hat, das auf irgendeinem anderen Werk basierte. Schon gar nicht auf einem Roman. Also es gab in der Firma keine Blaupause für sowas. Aber Balfour sagte, es war ihnen schon klar, dass wenn es eine 1:1 Umsetzung werden sollte, also wenn wir wirklich die Geschichte aus dem Roman nacherzählen wollen, dann muss es eigentlich ein Adventure-Spiel werden. Aber da gab es noch einen kommerziellen Aspekt, weil Interplay war ja nun erfolgreich in den Jahren zuvor mit Rollenspielen. Die wollten natürlich an den Erfolg ihrer Rollenspiele anknüpfen und sahen da auch die besten Marktchancen dafür. Und deswegen kam dann die Entscheidung für ein Hybridspiel. Also das Adventure war eher aus dem Quellwerk heraus und das Rollenspiel war eher aus der kommerziellen, der wirtschaftlichen Überlegung heraus. Er sagt also, warum sie jetzt das nicht 1:1 umgesetzt haben, war eben eine Mischung aus diesen spielmechanischen Limitierungen, weil eben auch dieser Rollenspielaspekt mit rein musste und schlichtweg auch technischen Limitierungen. Aber warum, fragten wir, haben sie denn dann den Humor reingebracht? Warum ist der Ton des Spiels so anders? Balfour glaubte sich daraufhin zu erinnern, dass das vermutlich einfach die Tonalität und der Humor des Teams bei Interplay war. Also, dass das ein Ausdruck von Interplay war und von den Menschen, die dieses Spiel gemacht hatten. Das war ihr Humor, das war auch vielleicht so ein bisschen Teil der Hackerkultur, der sie sich zugehörig gefühlt haben und aber auch eine Art, Selbstverwirklichung. Es sind ja wahnsinnig viele In-Jokes da drin, also viele Anspielungen auf Interplay-Spiele, auf Beteiligte aus dem Team, die ganzen Namen des Teams tauchen da auf im Spiel und so weiter. Balfour hatte aber auch die Hypothese, dass sich ein ernsthaftes Spiel schlechter verkauft hätte. Er glaubt, sich zu erinnern, dass sie auch der Meinung waren, dass es ein eher leichtherziges Spiel sein musste, dass Humor ein Anreiz war für die Spieler weiterzuspielen. Schwierig nachzuvollziehen, auch aus heutiger Perspektive, ob das wirklich ein stichhaltiges Argument damals gewesen sein mag oder nicht. Es erscheint mir zumindest nicht wahnsinnig stichhaltig, sagen wir es so. Balfour meinte auch, die Abweichung von der Romanhandlung hätte ihnen natürlich die Möglichkeit gegeben, viel mehr Variationen einzubauen, viel mehr eigene Dinge in diese Spielwelt reinzubringen. Das erscheint mir nachvollziehbar. Also im Endeffekt ist das Spiel ein eigener Interplay-spezifischer Spin auf diese Neuromancer-Welt. Sie haben die Welt genommen, nicht die Handlung des Romans, sondern die Welt des Romans und darin sich selbst aus ihrer eigenen Interplay-Perspektive verwirklicht, wenn man das so sagen möchte. Was immer noch nicht erklärt, warum das Spiel dann aber relativ spielmechanisch ist und so wenig Story drin ist, gerade aus der Perspektive von Bruce Balfour, der ist ja Autor. Der ist ja fürs Schreiben engagiert worden. Er hat ja auch echt viel geschrieben. Es ist ja auch viel Text drin in dem Spiel. Aber warum ist so wenig Handlung drin? Also warum wird so wenig erzählt, was eigentlich passiert? Das sind ja viel eher diese fragmentarischen Texte, dieser ganze Fluff, diese Weltbeschreibung und sowas. Darauf hatte Bruce Balfour keine richtig überzeugende Antwort. Ich glaube nicht, dass er sich da noch gut dran erinnert, wie es dazu kam. Er meinte sich zu erinnern, dass man die Story der Charaktere schon bekommt im Spiel, aber dass man sie halt verpassen kann, weil das so offen wäre. Da können wir dazu sagen, nein, das ist nicht so. Da gibt's einfach nicht viel im Spiel, was irgendwie die Handlung weitererzählen würde. Das sind halt diese kleinen Fragmente, aber das ist sicher nicht der hauptrote Faden, der einen durchs Spiel zieht. Letztendlich brachte Bruce Balfour das auf diese Formel, wir haben eine Welt gebaut, die auf dem Roman basiert, aber nicht auf der Handlung des Romans basiert. Also das, was ich vorhin auch schon gesagt hatte. Er hatte auch noch die Überlegung, ob da vielleicht auch technische Limitierungen eine Rolle gespielt haben könnten. Ich glaube, ehrlich gesagt, das ist kein Argument bei einer textbasierten Erzählung und es ist ja jede Menge Text im Spiel, also das kann es nicht sein. Unterm Strich müssen wir hier festhalten, wissen wir nicht genau. Also Bruce Balfour hatte leider keine gute Antwort darauf, warum es da keine stärkere Handlung gibt in dem Spiel. Und auch die Frage, warum zerfällt denn das so stark in diese 2 Akte? Also warum gibt es diesen Part mit Chiba City, wo man unterwegs ist, und dann diesen großen Cyberspace-Block? Darauf meinte Balfour, der Cyberspace war gedacht als eine Belohnung für die Anstrengungen der Spieler in diesem Realweltteil. Also erst müssen sie sich das erarbeiten, in dem Realweltteil in den Cyberspace zu kommen, und dann kommt der ganze Cyberspace-Teil als sozusagen Payoff, als Belohnung. Ja, in einer gewissen Weise ist das sicher richtig, so funktioniert das Spiel auch, dass der Cyberspace-Teil dann aber so groß ist und dass er auch so mechanisch ausfällt, ist natürlich nochmal ein anderer Aspekt. Wobei Bruce Balfour auch sagte, gut, im Roman sind sie am Ende des Romans auch überwiegend nur noch im Cyberspace unterwegs. Da spielt dann die Realwelt auch keine so große Rolle mehr. Unterm Strich ist Bruce Balfour stolz auf das Spiel. Also er freut sich, dass er damit mit seiner Arbeit an diesem Spiel Teil der Spielegeschichte geworden ist. Und das Spiel hat auch ein paar Auszeichnungen bekommen, da erinnert er sich ganz gut daran. Er hat für NEUROMANCER zwar keine Tantiemen bekommen, sondern nur ein festes Honorar, aber er ist ja dann später zu Sierra weitergegangen in seiner nächsten Station und erzählte, dass er dort dann auch Tantiemen für die Spiele bekommen hat. Also vor allen Dingen das zweite Laura Bow-Spiel, Daga of Amon-Ra und Outpost, die Spiele, an denen er federführend gearbeitet hat. Die liefen dann auch gut und er hat da gut dran verdient. Also er hat so eine Art Abschlussbetrachtung seiner Zeit in der Spielebranche, weil da ist er ja schon lange nicht mehr aktiv, wohlwollende und positive Worte und Erinnerungen darauf gefunden. Also zumindest auf die Zeit, in der er aktiv war. Er sagte, er ist raus aus der Spielebranche, als der Genrefokus sich verschoben hat, dann in der zweiten Hälfte der 90er auf Shooter. Und zumindest initial in dieser Ära waren Stories nicht sonderlich wichtig für Shooter. Da war Technologie wichtig, Grafik, Engines, Effekte, das stand im Vordergrund. Für ihn als Autor war das jetzt natürlich nicht so befriedigend. DreamWorks Interactive wurde damals gegründet als die Computerspiele-Sparte von DreamWorks, von dieser Filmfirma, und er erzählte uns, dass er damals einer der beiden Kandidaten für die Position des Geschäftsführers war, dass er da vorgesprochen hat, aber festgestellt hat, dass die so eine starke Fokus auf Grafik und grafische Darstellung haben, dass er sagte, das ist dann doch nichts für mich, und er ist dann aus Festanstellungen raus und hat noch eine Weile als freier Berater gearbeitet in der Spielebranche und dann hauptsächlich eben als Autor. Er hat auch noch seinen Doktor dann später gemacht und hauptsächlich dann Romane geschrieben. Aber, um vielleicht noch auf einer positiven Note zu enden, in der Zeit bei Sierra, erzählte uns, hat er dann auch seine Frau kennengelernt. Das war zur Zeit der Sprachaufnahmen für Laura Bow 2. Da kam auch eine CD-Version raus, die vertont war. Da hat er dann die Vorstellungsgespräche geführt von den Sprecherinnen und Sprechern. Er brauchte jemanden, der 3 Akzente beherrscht. Und da kam eine junge Kandidatin rein mit Theaterausbildung, die konnte das, die konnte diese ganzen Akzente sprechen. Dann sind die beiden von Oakhurst, dem kleinen Bergdorf, wo Sierra damals war, nach Fresno, der nächsten großen Stadt, gefahren, wo das Tonstudio war. 3 Stunden gemeinsam im Auto und haben dann da auch einige Wochen in dem Tonstudio gemeinsam verbracht und festgestellt, dass sie sich ganz gut verstehen. Tja, und ein paar Jahre später haben sie dann geheiratet. Also, die Spielebranche war gut für ihn, war gut zu ihm, sagte Bruce Balfour. Und NEUROMANCER ist ein Spiel, das er gerne in seinem Lebenslauf hat. So, und das war es, was er uns erzählte und damit auch das, was ich euch jetzt erzählt habe. Vielen Dank fürs Zuhören. Wir bedanken uns auch nochmal bei Bruce für das Interview und ich wünsche euch noch einen wunderschönen Tag. Tschüss.